Johnny, why do I keep putting everyone else's needs before my own and then end up resenting them for it? People pleasing is often a survival strategy. Kindness says, I want to help you. But people pleasing, that says, I need you to approve of me. And that is the difference. One comes from choice. The other one comes from fear. The reason they're like that is because we spent a very long time teaching them that we will always say yes. They know that when they ask, that you will say yes. And if every time they ask you say yes, why would they assume any different? Because every time you've said yes when you desperately wanted to say no, every time you stayed quiet, every time you ignored your own needs, you're making another withdrawal from your emotional bank account. And eventually you become overdrawn. You teach people how to treat you by the behaviors that you allow, the things that you do. They teach people because the goal isn't to become less kind. The goal is to stop. Hello and welcome to the Johnny Lawrence podcast. My name is Johnny Lawrence and we come to you today with something slightly different. But firstly, I had 24 hours in London. It was a flyby visit and I fitted in a lot. I got to hang out with James, whom I don't know if I even mentioned on this podcast. I've been doing another podcast called Men Behaving Honestly. Type it into, well, wherever, I suppose, wherever you get your podcasts, wherever you're listening to this on, type it in Men Behaving Honestly. And it's my friend and I's podcast, James Scheibe. And we have recorded 8 episodes as a season and we've talked to some amazing guests. We've had some mind-blowing conversations between ourselves and with these guests. And I really do think if you're a man and you are struggling, particularly with things like porn, with things like relationships, with things like alcohol, with things like health, whichever aspect of that you're thinking about, loneliness, anger, so many different topics, then this is the place for you. Why just men? Well, first of all, it's not for just men because there can also be the women in men's life try and get a different perspective for a deeper understanding. We're not always promising to have answers. We're just willing to have the challenging conversations. But I worked with a men's mental health charity recently, and it never occurred to me the impact I could have with men. And it felt amazing to have that time talking to men, to listen to men, to understand the frustrations, to understand the feelings of risk, the feelings of vulnerability, the lack of emotional literacy that's often present with men. And it felt like a real privilege. So I thought, how can I do something about it? Me and my mate James got chatting, and before you know it, we've created Men Behaving Honestly. So anyway, this is a long about way of saying, go and check it out. I think you really enjoy it. I saw him in London now. We are doing a recce for an event that we want to put on for men later in the year. So that was cool. I'm going to try something a bit different. Sometimes, every month I do like a guest interview. And I thought how cool it would be to just do it in person. So I hired a studio for a day and I did some recordings. And oh my God, these conversations were mind-blowing. Look, we can have really effective conversations online using different platforms and whatever else. But there's nothing like being in the room with somebody. There's nothing like feeling that emotion when they're talking. There's nothing like just being there with them and sharing that space, having that privilege of that time together, however long or short it is. And it was a game changer. So I'm hoping I can afford to keep doing it. So we'll see what happens. If you want to help me with that, get people to come and subscribe to the podcast, listen to the podcast, fire it out on social medias. Wow. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe. If you're watching on Spotify or listening on Apple, then follow and try and share it on socials, man. It would honestly I can't tell you the difference it makes when you talk about what you've learned. I get why you don't. I listen to plenty of podcasts and don't do that. I have to be reminded, just like they remind me to do, and I've done that recently. I've left reviews, all them sorts of things. So if you could do that, that'd be cool. Anyway, you're like, Johnny, you're going to do something different. Do you know what? I was sat with my wife recently and we were having a conversation about the podcast and some ways I could do things differently. And she's recently started helping me with my emails. And she noticed that I get the occasional email from somebody asking me questions. Stuff around self-development. And she said, you get these questions coming through. What do you do about that? I said, I reply. And she says, right. I said, yeah, you should see the ones I get on social media. And she said, what do you mean? And I told her about the messages I get on social media of people asking me questions. And she said, do you reply to all of these? I said, yeah, I try to. And she said, why don't you why don't you make these part of your podcast? And there was this moment of like, that's really obvious. Why didn't I think of that? I'll be honest with you. This is a moment I've experienced many times with my wife. She tends to have these incredible ideas. Like, for example, she was the one that came up with the name Men Behaving Honestly. Me and James sort of love-hate that she came up with that name. We love that we've got the name. We a little bit hate that she came up with it. We wish we had, but we didn't. So here it is. She's pretty much my muse. She's a genius, and I'm grateful to her. So I started correlating all these questions together. And I had some amazing questions and definitely had some solid talking points for the podcast. So I've got some questions up in front of me. I've got a feeling I'm probably only going to get through one because I'm probably going to give you the most wordy answer ever in history. But I have a question here from Sarah, age 36, in Manchester. That's in the UK for anyone listening outside of the UK. And it's, Johnny, why do I keep putting everyone else's needs before my own and then end up resenting them for it? Sarah, you might just be asking one of the most common questions. I say that because I want you to understand that there's nothing wrong with you on this one. This is something that we do as humans, and part of being human is to do things in a messy way. And I think that so many people listening to that question will recognize themselves in that question. Absolutely, myself included at times. Because I think on the surface, it looks like kindness and it feels like that's what we should do. That's the right thing to do. And I'm not saying it's not, because it can look like generosity. As I say, it can look like kindness, and it can look like being a good person, a good parent, a good friend, or a good colleague. And honestly, that's probably what you're doing. But underneath it, something very different is going on here, Sarah, because people pleasing isn't always an act of kindness. Sometimes it's an act of self-protection. And that's important. That's really, really important to what we're going to continue to talk about through this podcast. Because people pleasing is often a survival strategy. Now, do we know we're doing it? Not always. No. In fact, most often we don't know we're doing it. And that is part of the problem. Because awareness is always the first step to real, genuine, meaningful change. And becoming aware of what we're doing, why we're doing it, when we're doing it, is really the only options we have to provide the solution to these problems, and that is choice. Because let's face it, we're not born people pleasers. We're not there as babies and thinking, oh, I'm pretty hungry, I need my bottle. Mum, dad looks busy. I'll just wait, I think. I'll just wait, that'll make them happy. No, we cry. That's what we do. We cry as babies. We cry when we need changing. We cry when we need feeding. We cry when we're uncomfortable in some way, too hot, too cold, whatever it is. We cry. We want our response. We're not that concerned with other people's emotions and making them happy when we're born. So we're not born with people-pleasing tendencies. We become them over time. Maybe growing up, you learned that peace came from keeping everybody happy. Maybe love felt conditional. Maybe saying no led to rejection, criticism, or conflict. And over time, your nervous system learns something incredibly powerful. If everybody else is okay, I will be okay. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, you slowly stop asking yourself what you need. And instead, your attention is constantly scanning the room for everybody else's emotions. And I want to be clear, especially to you, Sarah, because I'm so grateful for this question. This isn't weakness. This doesn't mean you're a bad person or you're doing anything wrong. I really want you to know that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just hopefully helping you understand your problem and perhaps yourself a little bit deeper. And I'm going to try and provide some solutions perhaps, or some things you can do. I don't love the word solutions, like I've got all the solutions for you. That's not the case. I'm just giving you an insight and perspective that hopefully is helpful. And I'm pretty confident that once you have that understanding, that you'll start moving towards something that feels a little bit more aligned for you. Because it isn't weakness, it's conditioning. Now, that doesn't mean anyone's bad and they've conditioned you in any way that to do this. Sometimes it's just the way that your surroundings, all the people, all of the influences, all of the environments, all of those things all come together and they just create this conditioning that we begin to learn, and we navigate that and we find ways that make us feel better. Now, sometimes the things that make us feel better, sometimes the things that create safety aren't always the things that are intended. And sometimes that means that we end up following what's familiar and getting comfort from that instead. Your brain stops asking, what do I want? and starts asking, how do I stop anyone from being upset with me? That's the way you learn to navigate peace and to create happiness and harmony around you, especially in some environments. And I obviously don't know what your environment was like growing up. And this is why it's so important to understand that it's not necessarily, you don't have to grow up in an abusive environment. You don't have to grow up in a neglecting environment. You can just grow up in a busy environment. Maybe sometimes life was just really busy. People were just really busy and there was lots of siblings and there was someone working all the time. These aren't bad things, but they do make a difference to the way that you're brought up. And see, what can end up happening is that every decision then gets made through the eyes of avoiding discomfort instead of living life authentically. Because ultimately, resentment can be looked at as information. And one of my favorite perspectives is this. Resentment is rarely caused by what you've done for somebody. It's caused by what you've repeatedly done at the expense of yourself. That is different, because resentment isn't always about the other person. It's often about your own emotional alarm going off, saying, you've abandoned yourself again, which we've all felt, but maybe not heard it quite the way it was meant to be expressed within ourselves. Because every time you've said yes when you desperately wanted to say no, every time you stayed quiet, every time you ignored your own needs, you're making another withdrawal from your emotional bank account. And eventually, you become overdrawn. And it's so easy and so human to start blaming other people for expecting too much from us, especially when it's been going on for a while. But here's the hard bit, and Sarah, I really hope that you take this in a way that's intended. The reason they're like that is because we spent a very, very long time teaching them that we will always say yes. Because we always say yes. They know that when they ask, and even if you say no initially, they know that's just round one. They know that if they keep grinding away at you, that you will say yes. Or maybe you just say yes the first time. And the thing is, what we do over time, putting aside whether that's right or wrong, what we do over time is we teach them that it's worth pursuing because we will say yes eventually. And in a sense, that's not their fault. It's simply the relationship that we created. Now, I'm also not saying it's your fault. I'm just saying that's the way the situation is, because there's an important thing here that I say a lot to people, unfortunately. You teach people how to treat you. By the behaviors that you allow, the things that you do often, they teach people what your boundaries are, what you'll say yes to, what you'll say no to. We teach them how to treat us. Now, there's something about that feels blamey, and it's not a blame thing. It's more of an accountability thing. It's more me making sure that you realize that you have control here, that you can change this by changing your responses. That doesn't mean that the uncomfortable feeling will go away. It will feel really uncomfortable for a little while because it's unfamiliar behavior. But how cool is it that you have the power to make that change? That's really, really cool to know that, because it's not that they're bad people. It's just that human beings learn patterns. That's what we do. We're pattern recognizers. We're really, really good at it, whether we realize it or not. And if every time they ask you say yes, why would they assume any different is the truth. Because it's really easy to think that boundaries push people away. But actually, over time, healthy boundaries create healthy relationships. And most importantly, without boundaries, we become exhausted. We become frustrated. We become passive aggressive. We've all done it. And eventually, you find yourself exploding over something that seems really tiny and insignificant, which is frustrating within itself. And it's not because the tiny thing mattered, it's because it was the 100th time it's happened, or it's the 100th time you've felt that emotion. Here's the thing about boundaries. They stop that resentment from building long before it reaches that point. Because there is an important distinction. There's a huge difference between being kind and needing to be liked. Kindness says, I want to help you. We've all done that. We want to help someone. We help them happily, and we never regret it. We never feel resentment. But people pleasing, that says, I need you. I need you to approve of me. And that is the difference. One comes from choice. The other one comes from fear. So, Sarah, I said to you I was going to offer you a practical tool. And I want to make sure that you don't think this week I'm going to ask you to become a completely different person. I'm not going to do that. That's too much and ridiculous and probably won't work. So what we're going to do instead is we're just going to notice. You're just going to become an emotional investigator for a week. And every time somebody asks you something, I want you to pause for 5 seconds. You might feel crazy. You might look crazy. So what? Who cares? Just pause for 5 seconds. And ask yourself this: what do I actually want here? And follow that up with, am I saying yes because I genuinely want to, or because I'm afraid of disappointing somebody? And it's within that really small, tiny pause that you start to rebuild trust within yourself. Believe me, you'll notice it. And moving forward, if you're going to want to start installing boundaries, you're going to feel like you just want to go around installing boundaries everywhere. Some people turn into complete tyrants over 1 week. But actually, what I really strongly encourage is to choose one tiny boundary, tiny boundary this week. Just one. Please, just one. Not a huge one. Something really simple. Something really obvious, or now is obvious. It wasn't obvious before. And it could be something like saying, not tonight, or I can't help this weekend, or classic, let me get back to you. You might have heard that from somebody else, or simply, that doesn't work for me. And I want you to notice what happens. People won't react nearly as badly as your mind predicts. However, you probably will. And you'll realize that a lot of this perceived discomfort comes from you, Sarah. And that means something. It also gives you power, because it means that you could do something about it too. As hard as it might feel, as impossible as it might feel, as uncomfortable as it might feel. Because I don't think resentment is the enemy here. I actually think resentment is the messenger. It's the emotion that quietly asks, when are you going to start treating yourself with the same care that you treat everybody else? Man, it's a big question. Because the goal isn't to become less kind. That's not what the goal is. The goal is to stop being the person that your kindness never reaches. That's the goal. And if I was to finish with a really powerful question, or one that I think is powerful, you might not, I'd probably finish with this. What am I hoping others will give me that I have not yet learned to give myself? It's a really powerful question. Anyway, I thought I'd try something different. Let me know what you think of this. And if you want to ask questions, please reach out on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok if you want to. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast this week, and I will see you next week for another episode of the Johnny Lawrence Podcast.